Millionaire sees twin girls being auctioned in the street, and his actions make the whole city cry. Lily and Lucy Thompson were 6-year-old twins of Maplewood. Their real father had perished in an accident on the Levee Road at the end of the rainy season. Their mother, Margaret Thompson, worked double shifts at the diner until she collapsed, left behind in room 203 of the town hospital with a plastic bracelet cutting into her wrist. From that day forward, the two children lived with their stepfather, Calvin Brooks. He carried in his pocket a sheaf of papers called community debts, stamped with bright red seals, and the signatures of men who preferred to sit behind wooden desks. Today, hoping to wipe away some of the numbers pressing down upon him, he decided to march the two girls into the marketplace. Lily clutched a rag doll with a missing arm. Across the doll's stitched belly, she had fastened a small slip of paper she had written herself. "Do not cry in front of the brute." Lucy kept their mother's plastic bracelet hidden in her jacket pocket, her finger raw and swollen from sucking out of fear. The window of their room had once been nailed shut, and Lily had memorized the sound of each nail groaning whenever the night wind pushed against it. This morning the wind still blew, but it was Calvin who opened the door. "Move," he said, dragging the two children off the porch. His laces hung loose, the metal clasp on his wrist jingling in step with his stride. The sour trace of cheap liquor led the way. Maplewood was not wealthy enough to conceal its poverty, nor poor enough to shed all shame. The makeshift market sprawled along the main road, torn tarps sagging over baskets of corn and tubs of red onions. People looked, then turned away when Calvin shoved Lucy out of the shade of the awning and yanked Lily along behind. The corn seller whispered to the man at the next stall. "Calvin strapped again." The neighbor replied, "Strapped men pawn what they can." Calvin halted in the open space before the loudspeaker pole. From his pocket he pulled a stained piece of brown cardboard, upon which 4 oversized English words were scrawled, far too large for a child's neck. "Needy family up for adoption." He hung the board around Lily's neck, then Lucy's lassicanta.com. The rope scraped their skin, leaving red marks. Lily raised her hand to cover her sister's sign as though covering a wound. "Lily," Lucy whispered, her eyes blinking fast. "Let's go home to Mama." "Not yet." Lily pressed her forehead against her sister's. "Mama told us to wait, but she isn't coming anymore." The loudspeaker sputtered with a harsh announcement about closing hours. The air thickened with the smell of burnt grease, sweat, and the rinse water from butchered meat. A tall, gaunt man stepped forward, regarding the children as though looking at the hindquarters of a calf. "How much?" he asked. Calvin grinned crookedly, rubbing the rim of a bottle with his finger. "Wipe out the debt." "How much debt?" the man pressed, eyes flicking across the small faces. "More than the heap of papers I signed." Calvin jerked his chin toward the town hall. "They keep their records. All I need is money." A feeble whistle rose from the onion stall. A woman stepped nearer, hand half lifted toward Lily's shoulder, then drew back at the sight of Calvin's glare. Lucy bit her lip until blood showed. Lily pressed the doll against her chest, the slip of paper in its belly scratching her palm with a faint warmth. A few steps away, a silver-haired man stood silent in the edge of the shade, his hat brim low, his left hand tucked in his coat pocket, where an old pocket watch rested. He had just stepped off the early bus, passing quietly by the new painted board outside the town hall that read, "Community Contribution Assistance Program." His name was Edward Whitmore. In his suitcase lay a frayed photograph and a sealed envelope from the state troopers, marked with the case number of a year drowned in rain. He had returned to unlock a house where wind chimes had long been silent, but now, his eyes fastened upon the brown cardboard sign hanging from the children's necks. Edward stepped out of the shade and nearer, his voice low, steady, neither harsh nor soft. "What are you planning to do with them?" Calvin squinted. "None of your business." He moved closer, the stench of liquor wafting. "Do you know who I am?" "Calvin Brooks," Edward replied, standing 2 arm lengths away like a man accustomed to measuring distance. "And I am Edward Whitmore." A faint murmur rippled through the stalls. Everyone had heard the name. The Whitmores once owned the granary on the hill, then vanished from town for over a decade. What they did not know was the pocket watch, etched with a name as thin as a scratch, whose ticking sometimes rang in Edward's ears even when the wind was still. "The rich old man comes back," Calvin sneered. "Looking to play the hero?" Edward did not answer him. He looked at Lily. The girl's knuckles had gone white from clutching her doll. He looked at Lucy. Her eyes were swollen from nights without rest. He drew in a breath. The grit of dust and the bitter salt of sweat touched his tongue, and he exhaled slowly, counting it out. "You said, wipe out the debt," he spoke, still watching the children. "Name the sum." Calvin recited it. The number was higher than the real debt. A few bystanders glanced at one another. Edward did not bargain. He drew his checkbook, laid it upon a wooden crate beside the onions, and wrote. The black pen cut a steady line, the sound of paper tearing free sharp as a knife gliding across wood. He slid the check toward Calvin. "You signed so quickly?" Calvin laughed. The hollow laugh of an empty bottle. "That's fortune for me." "No one finds fortune in this," Edward answered, turning at last to the children. "Come along." Calvin thrust his arm out, his hand gripping Lucy's shoulder. She recoiled as if from fire. "You think one piece of paper settles it?" "There's still—" Edward brushed his hand aside. Not hard, not fast, but with the firmness of pulling out a nail driven wrong. "You said it yourself. Clearing the debt is enough." He stooped, one arm sliding under Lily, the other around Lucy's back. Their bodies were so light, his shoulders ached in another way, the ache of knowing such weight should never be so little. Calvin made to seize his wrist. At the onion stall, a hand rose halfway as if to intervene, then fell again. None stepped forward. A metal spoon dropped into a basin, its ring sharp and cold, then silence. "Get out," Calvin muttered after glancing at the check once more, tucking it into his inner pocket. He stepped back, his eyes fixed upon the three backs retreating. Edward gave no reply. Carrying the children, he walked past baskets of corn, jars of lard, and eyes straining to look away. Lily rested her head on his shoulder, her sweat-damp hair still cold to the touch. Lucy looked back at the loudspeaker pole, then at the empty space where Calvin stood like a misplaced fence post. "You won't leave us, will you?" Lucy said, her voice as thin as a thread. Edward tightened his grip. It was not a promise, merely a breath given shape. He slowed as they passed the stone wall, stooped to pick up the rag doll that had slipped from Lily's hand. Dusting it off, he held it out and asked, "What's her name?" "I haven't named her," Lily murmured. "I thought Mama would name her, but Mama's been too busy." "Well, now she has someone to hold her." Edward said it quietly, then pressed his lips together, as if to check whether he had spoken out of turn. Lily clutched the doll closer. The slip of paper inside the doll's belly rubbed against her palm, warmer now. Leaving the market. The wind swept up the dirt slope toward the hill. Dry grass crackled against their trouser legs. A black dog darted across, licked Lucy's wrist in passing, and vanished into the brush. The child let out a soft laugh, a laugh not yet accustomed to being called by name. Edward untied the rope holding the sign from Lucy's neck, coiled it, and slipped it into his outer pocket with the watch. The bold letters, blurred with sweat, looked as though they had been scribbled in a drunken hurry. "Does your house have windows?" Lucy asked, eyes fixed on the road climbing the hill. "At home. Our windows are nailed shut." "Yes, and they open." Edward adjusted Lily's hat. "The wind comes in, the dust as well. But the wind is meant to come in." Below in the market, the loudspeaker switched on again, announcing the schedule for the next day's community contributions. The voice drifted up the slope and dissolved like salt in water. Edward halted precisely at the line between hearing and silence, his hand brushing the pocket where the watch lay. He did not open it. He only drew the children tighter against him before moving on. "Grandpa," Lily suddenly called, a single word, small enough not to touch the ground. She startled herself, as if she had dropped a pebble into still water. Edward did not turn his head. The corner of his mouth lifted in so slight a curve that one could see it only by standing near. Yes, the wooden steps of the hilltop house appeared, darkened with age. The front door was shut tight, the hinges groaning long as he turned the key. Cold air spilled out, carrying the scent of dry wood and dust. Edward set Lily and Lucy down, stepped half a pace back, and opened his hand wide. "Go on in." Lily took Lucy's hand and led her across the threshold. Lucy glanced back at the slope they had climbed, where a black speck still lingered. She narrowed her eyes, uncertain whether it was a man or the shadow of a fence post. The door closed. One last gust of wind swept through, carrying the smell of old straw. The shadows of 3 people and 1 rag doll stretched long across the floor, joined in a single unbroken line. Outside, the road dust kept on drifting. Inside, the dry light carved squares across the wooden planks, and somewhere between shade and brightness, the breath of 2 children found its rhythm with the heartbeat of the silver-haired man. By noon, Maplewood was as noisy as ever. Only one thing remained silent, yet unknown. That night, someone would come knocking. The house on the hill was so quiet, one could hear the fall of dust. Edward set the children down, removed his hat, and hung it on the rusty hook beside the door. "Wash your hands," he said evenly, pointing toward the old enamel basin in the kitchen. The faucet dripped in uneven drops. Lily waited for her sister first, handed her the dry towel, and only then wiped her own hands. Her small hands trembled in faint circles, trembling, then gripping tight again. Edward opened the kitchen cupboard. Inside lay a box of soup powder, 2 sprouted potatoes, a clumped sack of salt. He pushed the spoiled things aside, lit the stove. Damp wood made the smoke sting his eyes. He stacked 2 bricks to hold the pot, pulled the lid into place. "Sit down." He placed 2 chairs close to the table. Lily pulled one out for Lucy first. Both set their feet gently, as though fearing the wooden floor might creak. May I put the doll somewhere?" Lily asked. "On the table." Edward glanced around, picked a chipped porcelain plate, and set it carefully in place. "She can sit beside you." The water boiled. He poured in the soup powder, stirred, added salt. The spoon clicked against the pot in quiet rhythm. Lucy watched the whirl of liquid, lips pressed as though bracing for a sudden knock at the door. None came, only the hiss of the fire and the wind slipping through the cracks. The meal was poor but warm. Lily laid her spoon down before Lucy lifted hers. "Eat, sister," Lily said. Lucy tried a sip, blew long upon it, then handed the spoon to her. Edward sat opposite, his hands still smelling of ash. He ate slowly, eyes following the children's spoons. From time to time, Lucy startled at a stray sound, the ladle falling lightly. The curtain brushing the door, then steadied herself by touching the plastic bracelet in her pocket. "Does this window open?" Lucy asked. "Yes." Edward rose, tried the latch. The frame stuck. From a drawer he fetched pliers, pried out the old nails someone had driven to seal it shut. The nails sprang free with a dry snap. Fresh air swept in. The garden leaves rustled. Lily tilted her head back, drawing a deep breath. Lucy pushed the window farther, then pulled her hand back quickly, as if fearing rebuke for an old habit. "Good," Edward said. And nothing more. He shook out a cloth, wiped the dust quickly from the table. The wind chime that had hung for years upon the porch stirred faintly, the metal tubes striking a thin sound. Lily gazed toward the door, folding her hands in her lap. Lucy tilted her head to listen. "Our house had something like that," Lucy whispered, "but it was taken down. It stays here." Edward fastened the cord more firmly, turned back to the kitchen. He set 3 bowls upside down upon the table to dry fully. For the first time that day, none of them hurried. After eating, Edward cleared the dishes, carried the basin outside. The children followed, standing close upon the back steps. The yard held a cracked cement sink, the spout rusty but still running. "You've soup stuck in your teeth," Lily teased with a half smile. Lucy smiled too, a thin, fleeting smile, like sunlight flashing from an aluminum spoon. From the storeroom, Edward pulled 2 quilts laundered in some past season and a box of old belongings. He did not open the box, only set it in the corner, covering it with the quilts as one covers a thing one means to forget for a time. On top of the cupboard lay a picture frame face down. He touched its edge, then left it as it was. "Would you rather sleep together or apart?" he asked, while laying out the quilts in the side room. "Together." Lily answered first. Lucy nodded hard. Edward drew the bed closer to the wall, checked the frame for creaks. None. He walked a slow circle of the room, tested the outlets, covered the broken one with tape, wedged cardboard in the door crack so the wind would not whistle. Lucy watched each motion, as though learning the new laws of a house. Lily placed the doll upon the pillow, smoothed the hem of its dress. "Sir," Lily called as Edward was about to step out, "if we dream bad dreams tonight, may we call for you?" "Yes." He nodded from the doorway. "Call loud." At the old house, if we called loud, it made the shouting worse, Lucy whispered, voice lowered, as though fearing the walls might overhear. "Here, if you call loud, I wake." Edward added the single word to make it plain. "Understood?" The 2 children looked at one another, then nodded in solemn unison, like comrades sealing an agreement. He returned to the kitchen, washed the dishes, scrubbed the pot. Soap water ran along the gutter, bright beneath the sunlight, then vanished. He wrung the cloth, hung it on the hook. On the table lay the brown sign once hung from Lucy's neck, its letters blurred. Edward folded it, placed it in the 3rd drawer, the one he kept for things to remember, to burn later. Evening fell, the tree shadows from the yard stretching to the porch. Lily and Lucy sat on the steps, legs folded upon the wooden boards. Lily took a blunt pencil from her dress pocket, sketched upon a piece of carton salvaged from the storeroom. A window open, with lines outside for wind. Lucy rested her chin on her hands, pointing now and then for her sister to add. "Draw a bell," Lucy urged, "so we'll know if someone comes." "Where's our bell?" Lily asked. "We have none," Edward answered plainly. "Tomorrow I'll make one." "You can make one?" Lucy looked up. Like pulling nails?" "It's nails as well." Edward shrugged, though his mouth softened at the corners. They sat a while in silence. The wind shifted. The smell of straw and damp earth mingled with the ash of the stove. Above, sparrows flitted branch to branch. From the distance, the loudspeaker at the market read off a list of names for tomorrow's meeting at the town hall. The sound, thinned climbing the hill, fell apart into scraps of meaninglessness. Lily set down her pencil, gazed at the sketch. "Mama said," she murmured as though to herself, "do not cry before the brute." Then she put the pencil away, tilted the board so the wind could dry the faint gray of the graphite. Supper was toasted bread with a bit of butter. Edward set a jar of strawberry jam, long forgotten in the refrigerator, upon the table and twisted it open. The sour tang of fermented fruit rose out. "Let me see if it's still fit to eat." He tasted, frowned, tightened the lid, and dropped it into the trash. Spoiled. He poured 2 cups of powdered milk, mixed with warm water. Lucy took the first sip, her eyes widening. Sweet. Lily held her cup with both hands, drinking slowly, as though waiting for the milk to change its mind and vanish. Afterward, Edward brought from the cupboard a box of colored pencils, most of them without caps, and set it upon the table. "If you wish to keep drawing." Lily slid the box toward Lucy first. Lucy chose the blue, switched to yellow, then laughed when both colors smeared across her fingertips. Lily wiped them clean with the hem of her dress. "Tell us a story," Lucy said, resting her chin on the edge of the table. "Just a short one." Edward thought a moment. He was not skilled at telling stories. He only knew how to say what needed saying, to fill the empty spaces of a day. "Once," he began, "this house had a wind chime made from bottle caps. Whenever the wind blew, it clattered. Each time we heard it, the people inside knew the wind had come through the door. So that means the door was open, Lily continued, as though taking up a verse of song, and when the door's open, you can breathe easier. Yes. Edward looked toward the porch. Tomorrow I'll hang the chime again. The wind comes in, and the house will hear it. Before bedtime, Edward handed each child a new toothbrush he had bought at the general store along the way home. Lucy fiddled with peeling the label. Lily cautioned, "Don't snap it." The two went to brush their teeth. The sound of water striking enamel basin clearer than the sound of wind. Edward laid an extra quilt upon them, tucked its corners in as the nurses at the hospital would. He lingered a moment at the doorway, watching the two small heads close together, the rag doll between. "Sleep now," he said. The lamp went out. In the kitchen, the last coals glowed faintly. Edward sat at the table, opened his pocket watch. The hands ticked forward. He closed it again. The wind chime on the porch gave a faint stir, audible only if one held breath. Edward wrote upon a slip of paper set in the first drawer. Nails, bell, milk, mattress. He added another line, paused, then marked only a dot. Hospital. Night deepened. Wooden walls held the chill. The floorboards held sound. In the next room, Lucy turned in her sleep. Lily pulled the quilt higher over her, then released it, remembering that tonight no one would yank it away. A cricket sang in the door crack. From afar, trucks rumbled by like distant thunder. Then came the sound not loudspeaker, not falling spoon but 3 knocks upon wood. Slow and deliberate. Lily's eyes opened. Lucy sat up straight, hands searching for the plastic bracelet in the pocket beside her pillow. They looked at one another, no words needed. In the kitchen, Edward's chair creaked softly as he rose. He stepped onto the porch. The chime was still. His hand rested on the latch. "Sir," Lily called just loud enough from the room. "If it's a good person, they'll call their name first." Edward drew breath, let it out. Yes. He did not ask who was there. He only stepped back, lifted a finger to his lips for silence, though the children had been silent already. 3 more knocks came, this time leaning slightly rightward, as if the knocker pressed his shoulder against the frame. Edward peered through the narrow crack. He saw nothing but a black shape splintered by moonlight. His hand remained on the latch, not yet turning. Behind him, Lily clasped Lucy's hand. Both listened to the beat of their hearts until it blended with the ticking of the watch in his pocket. A gust swept across the porch roof and fell still, as though the house itself was holding its breath. 3 more knocks. Slow. Heavy. Edward kept his hand upon the latch, leaning to peer through the crack. A figure slumped against the frame, and the smell of liquor reached him first. "Speak your name," he said. Voice low. Not asking. A pause, then a rasping laugh. "Open up, old man. Speak your name." A breath hissed between teeth. "Calvin. Calvin Brooks." Inside the room, Lily clutched Lucy's hand, pulling her down to the edge of the bed. The rag doll lay between them, its black button eyes staring up at the ceiling. Edward lowered the latch 1 notch but kept his boot braced at the threshold. He opened the door a sliver, enough for air to slip through. Light from the kitchen stretched out in a narrow strip, brushing across the muddy tips of Calvin's shoes. "Give me back my girls," Calvin said. His eyelids drooped, his lips oily. "You carried them off by day. By night, you return them." "They sleep here tonight," Edward answered. "Tomorrow you bring your papers to the courthouse. We will speak before the man with the seal." Calvin laughed, broken, jagged. "You think a check bought you anything? At the market, you played your show. Here, you've no audience." Edward lifted the back of his hand, pressed the door nearer shut, holding its opening to the breadth of a palm. "I did not buy. I pried your hands from their throats." Calvin lunged, shoulder pressing at the door. Edward did not step back. He sank his heel into the threshold, spine straight, hand clamped to the edge of the door like a vice. The door rebounded against Calvin's shoulder with a thud. In the yard, a cricket fell silent. On the porch roof, the wind chime gave a single short tremor. "You stole them from me," Calvin spat. "They are mine on paper. Their mother lies in a hospital bed, without a voice." "You hung up for adoption around their necks in the marketplace," Edward said, his tone unchanged. People stood and watched. I stood and watched. Then I lifted them. "You took the money." Calvin snorted, his fingernail tapping the frame, scraping a flake of paint. "I took money to clear a debt, not to be lectured." Edward drew a phone from his pocket, held it level with his eyes, switched on the light. "Step into the beam." The light swept Calvin's face, showing the red veins across his eyes. Edward pressed once. The click sounded like a hook tightening in a ledger. "What game's this?" Calvin threw up his hand to shield his face, cursing. "Why take my picture?" "To remember," Edward said, "and to hand to the man with the seal, if need be." Calvin swallowed dry. He stepped back half a pace, then forward again. "I'll return," he growled, "with men from the courthouse." "Do not return tonight," Edward said. "Tonight there are only children and an old man." The scrape of shoes across the porch. Then steps down. Calvin paused in the yard, lifting his head to measure the frame, as though calculating how many bones stood behind it. "You think you're strong?" He spat into the grass, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "You think Maplewood needs a man like you?" Edward gave no answer. He kept the light steady, enough that Calvin knew he was seen. "They are my coin," Calvin muttered, voice smaller, as if already accustomed to speaking through gates rather than doors. "I feed them. I use them." "I know what you do," Edward said. He nudged the door another half-inch shut. "Go to bed, Calvin." Calvin stood a while, unmoving. Then he turned, staggering down the dirt road. The gravel crunched beneath his soles like spoons rattled in a basin. At the end of the yard, he glanced back, his shadow long, though his face stayed outside the light. "I'll return. With papers." Then he vanished. Edward kept his hand on the latch for several heartbeats, listening as the chime stirred once, faintly. He slid the bolt firm, dragged a wooden table across the door. An old habit. In the side room, Lily still clung to Lucy. Their breathing settled back to its short, familiar rhythm. He went into the kitchen, opened the third drawer, and pulled out the folded brown sign. He set it upon the table beside the pocket watch. The bold letters, blurred with sweat, looked now like spilled ink. He opened the watch. The hands creaked forward one small notch. He shut it, drew his pen, and wrote on the slip in the first drawer, "Door bolt table, chime, photograph Calvin, courthouse papers." "Sir," Lily called from the kitchen doorway, barefoot, hair loose. "Is he gone?" "Yes." Edward lowered his voice. "Back to bed." "Did you lock it well?" Lucy peeked past her sister, white plastic bracelet clutched tight. "Yes," Edward said. He pointed to the table braced across the door, tried the bolt once more so both could hear the click. "Do you hear?" They nodded. Lily glanced at the sign upon the table, blinking. "Will you throw it away?" "Not yet," Edward said. "Tomorrow." "Burn it," Lucy whispered, "so it leaves no smell." "Tomorrow," Edward repeated. He poured warm water, handed each a cup. "Drink, then sleep." When they were gone, Edward opened the cupboard, fetched a few spoons, strung them as a makeshift chime across the kitchen doorframe with a length of fishing line. He tugged, the spoons struck, ringing a sound not sweet, but sound enough. He nodded. From the porch, the old metal wind chime answered with two short notes, as though in a chord. He turned back into the kitchen, tidied. By the time he rinsed the last bowl, the water had gone cold. He dried his hands, stared at his own reflection in the kitchen glass, a dark block with a streak of silver at the temple. Outside, the wind shifted. Upon the table, the phone glimmered with the pale blue of the photo just taken. Calvin's face caught in the light, every red vein revealed. Edward dimmed the screen, slipped it into his pocket. He sat, opened the watch again. The hands ticked. He closed it, slid it back into his coat, burying a deep breath there with it. Late in the night, Lily stirred awake. She did not scream, she only sat upright, arms wrapped around her belly. Lucy opened her eyes as well. "Bad dream?" Lily asked softly. "Number?" Lucy shook her head. "I heard the spoons." The two of them sat still. There was no sound of spoons, only insects. Then came the crunch of a tire rolling over gravel out on the road, fading away. Lily let out her breath. "It's nothing." "Is he asleep?" Lucy asked. Lily pinched the edge of the blanket. "He sleeps like a man guarding a gate." Both lay back down. The rag doll rested between them, its belly stiff with the tiny slip of paper inside. Lucy touched it, felt warmth. She closed her eyes, whispering the words someone had once written, "Do not cry before the cruel." In the outer room, the wooden chair creaked now and then as Edward shifted his weight. By dawn, silver mist covered the hill. Edward rose early and set water to boil. He added to the slip of paper, "Hospital Room 203. He underlined it. On the windowsill, the old nails he had pulled the night before lay in a row like fish bones. Lily came into the kitchen first, her hair a tangle. "Where are you going today, sir?" "Town hall," Edward replied, rummaging in the cupboard for coffee. "And the hospital?" "For Mama?" Lucy poked her head around the corner, her voice lighter. "Yes." Edward turned, looking at both. "Stay home. Do not open the door. If the kitchen chime rings, call out loud. The neighbor on the left is Bales. Do you remember?" "Bales," Lily repeated. "With the black dog." "That's right," Edward nodded. He placed 2 slices of toast on the table, a butter knife, and a green pencil. "Your work, draw where the bell should hang." "Treble or bass?" Lucy blinked. "Whatever rings," Edward shrugged, "so long as it rings." When they had finished, he changed his coat and set his hat. Before stepping out, he tugged once more on the string of spoons. The faint clatter was small, yet enough to mark the line between inside and out. He lifted the latch, glanced into the yard. Dew beaded on the old clothesline. No new footprints. Lily ran up, holding the rag doll. "Take it with you," she said, as though offering a charm. So you'll remember to come back." Edward smiled thinly. "I need no charm for that." Yet he accepted it, placing the doll upon the shelf near the nail he had pulled last night. "It waits here for me." He laid his hand on Lily's head, then upon Lucy's shoulder. "I'll be back around noon. If you meet him." Lucy looked down at her plastic bracelet. "I'll speak to the man with the seal first." Edward cut in. No more words needed. He locked the door from within, left the outer latch open, and stepped off the porch. The wind chime rang a brief chain of notes, like a greeting. From the dirt road, Maplewood appeared blurred with mist, its faded signs and rusted lampposts. Halfway down the slope, he stopped, pulled out his phone, checked the photograph from last night. He pressed save, then slipped the phone into the inner pocket, where the watch lay also. Below, near the marketplace, the loudspeaker began the day anew. The words, "community contribution," drifted up the hill again, thinning as they went. Edward raised his collar and walked faster. At the house, the 2 children dragged chairs onto the porch. Lily used the green pencil to sketch a bell. Lucy sat beside her, dotting small circles like raindrops. On the table lay Edward's slip of paper, its 4 lines written in even, spare letters plans meant to replace waiting. At the bottom, a single dot of ink had fallen when he thought of the name Caroline Hayes, but did not write it. The dot dried quickly. The wind shifted once, glancing back at the porch. The chime sounded. The girls lifted their heads. At the foot of the hill, the figure of a silver-haired man merged with the mist, his left hand brushing his coat pocket from time to time, as though keeping pace with something unseen yet undeniably real. Inside the house, the folded brown sign lay in the third drawer. It would burn, but not this morning. And in the first drawer, beside the lined courthouse papers, the words Hospital Room 203 remained, waiting for a mark of completion. The Maplewood Town Hall shone like a polished box. Black and white tiles covered the floor, and a notice board on the wall read, Community Contribution Program, Benefits for Every Home. Edward stood at the counter, resting his elbow on the wooden edge worn smooth by years of use. "What do you need?" the clerk asked without looking up from her ledger. "I want to review the debt records tied to the Thompson family," Edward said, "and any custody authorization documents. To review records, you'll need to file Form 12B. She slid a stack of papers through the slot. "Processing time, 14 business days. Is there any way to speed that up when a child's safety is involved?" Edward kept his tone steady. "Write urgent on the top right corner." She still didn't raise her head. "Then wait." Edward nodded, picked up the pen, and filled in his name, phone number, and the address on the hill. When he reached the line that said, "Relationship to the subject of the file," he paused a beat and wrote, "Temporary guardian. Disputed." For the first time, the clerk looked up, her eyes colder than the glass between them. "Do you have proof? I've got the check I used to pay off Calvin Brooks's debt. And I have photos of him showing up at the house last night demanding to take back the two girls." Edward placed his phone on the counter and opened the photo. The porch light caught Calvin's face, his bloodshot veins stark in the glow. The woman glanced just long enough to check whether the image was blurry, then slid the phone back. 14 days, she repeated. "If anything comes up, the council will call." "Call before someone knocks on my door in the middle of the night," Edward said, tucking the form into a folder and pocketing his phone. "I'll be back." He walked past the notice board. A business card had slipped loose and hung by one pin. Law Office, Coleman and Company, Civil Counsel. Edward glanced at it but didn't take it. At the exit, the wind carried out the smell of fresh ink and floor wax. He pulled his hat low and crossed the street. The town hospital sat beside a sun-scorched lawn. Room 203 had pale green curtains, the figure inside half hidden by their folds. Rebecca lay on her side, her pale wrist showing the mark where a plastic band had been removed. The heart monitor ticked steadily, like a slow practice drill. "Who are you here for?" asked the duty nurse, her badge reading C. Hayes. "Rebecca Thompson." Edward removed his hat, standing 2 arms' lengths from the bed. "I want to know her condition and the legal process if temporary custody becomes necessary." Caroline Hayes studied him from nose to wrist, as if measuring whether he was the sort to cause a scene. "She's stabilizing, needs rest. Temporary custody has to go through the court." "I was just at the courthouse," Edward said. "They told me 14 days. That's the procedure." Caroline nodded. "In practice, you already know." Edward didn't smile. He pulled a slip of paper from his pocket. "My number, if anyone comes to visit and they don't look like family." Caroline accepted it, tucking it into her pocket. "And you are, what to them?" "The one who opens the window," Edward replied, as if no further explanation was needed. He placed a bag of apples on the bedside table, "for when she wakes." Caroline glanced at the apples, one corner of her mouth twitching. "If you want to speak with her doctor, come back this afternoon." Then softer, as though speaking to her gloved hand, "If you step into this, you'll be stepping into the entire council." "I already have." Edward set his hat back on. "Thank you." Back at the house on the hill, the two girls had woken early. Lily spread a piece of cardboard on the porch and sketched a large bell with her pencil. Lucy added small dots around the bell, calling them raindrops. Mr. Bales's black dog came by the gate, growled once, then wagged its tail, eyes glowing yellow like 2 coins. Lucy reached her hand through the slats. The dog licked quickly and backed away. Mr. Bales appeared behind the dog, carrying a jar of pickles. "You girls all right?" he asked, voice raspy from coal smoke. "If Cole barks too much, let me know. I'll tie him up." "He's not loud," Lily said, setting her pencil down. "He just says hello." "Hello ought to be polite." The old man chuckled, setting the jar on the fence post. "If you need me, pull this cord." He threaded a thin rope through the fence, the other end tied to a tin can hanging on his porch. "It makes a racket." Lucy tugged it once, the can clattering loud and dry. She startled, then laughed. Mr. Bales nodded and stepped back. "Don't open the door unless you hear a voice you know." "Yes, sir," Lily and Lucy answered together, solemn. The sun climbed higher, the wind carrying the smell of straw and coal briquettes. Lily finished outlining the bell in blue pencil. Lucy added a small string connecting the bell to the doorway. On the table lay 2 slices of bread with butter crumbs and 2 cups still smelling of milk. Footsteps came up the slope. Edward appeared at the gate, holding a bag of nails, a small brass bell shining in his hand, and a paper sack with a long loaf of bread. "For lunch," he said, setting the bread down and handing the bell to Lily, the nails to Lucy. "Half the morning's work done." "And the other half?" Lucy asked. "This afternoon." Edward pulled out a chair, sat to catch his breath, and scanned the air as though checking whether the color of the day had changed while he was gone. "Anyone come by?" "Mr. Bales," Lily answered, "and the dog." Edward nodded. "Good." He picked up the brass bell and gave it a shake. The sound rang full and round. He rose, measured a spot on the doorframe with his finger, and tapped in 2 round-headed nails. Each hammer strike made Lucy blink, but she didn't step back. The bell hung just at a child's reach. Lily pulled the cord, and the ring carried through the kitchen, struck the walls, then faded. "Good," Edward said. "If someone comes, the bell rings. If the door shakes and you don't hear the bell, don't open." "He said he'd come back," Lucy whispered, "with someone carrying a seal." "Then we've got a bell too," Edward replied. He pulled another sheet of paper from his pocket, stuck it to the cupboard, and wrote in bold black letters, 1. Don't open the door. 2. Ring the bell. 3. Call Bales. 4. Meeting place. Kitchen porch. He handed the pen to Lily. "Add this. 5. Draw when you're scared." "Draw when you're scared?" Lucy frowned. Edward said, "Keep your hands busy. When your hands are busy, your mind doesn't run." Lily carefully added line number 5. Lucy set her pencil to the paper and wrote the word rain next to the bell, then looked pleased with herself. They ate bread with butter and apples. Edward sliced the apple into 8 even pieces, handed 2 to each girl, and kept 2 for himself. "At the courthouse," he said between bites, "they told me 14 days for processing. Feels as long as winter," Lucy blurted out. "Not that long," Edward smiled, "but long enough for nails to rust." "And Mom?" Lily asked, setting her slice down. "More stable," Edward answered simply. "Needs rest." Both girls nodded, as if checking off a box in their minds. Edward gathered the apple peels and carried them out to the garden bed. As he lifted his head, he noticed a smear of fresh mud on the doorframe. He touched it with his finger still damp. His eyes shifted to the porch step, where a shoe print crossed the edge, one that wasn't his. He said nothing. He only wiped it away slowly with a rag. "Are you going out again?" Lily asked when she saw him changing into his coat. "Just around," Edward replied. "Hospital. Maybe back to the courthouse to turn in the form. Do you carry the bell in your pocket?" Lucy half joked, half serious. "I carry something else." Edward tapped the inside pocket where his phone and pocket watch rested. Enough. Before leaving, he tested the bell once more. Its chime carried across the porch, fading into the wind. He locked the latch, dragged the wooden table against the door from the inside, leaving the kitchen door cracked open just an inch for the breeze. Remember Mr. Bales's cord, he reminded, pointing toward the fence to the left. Remember, Lily repeated, her eyes following the bell's cord, as if learning to connect 2 points on a map. Edward walked off, his figure folding into the sunlight. The 2 girls went back to the kitchen, spread out their paper. Lucy drew a small box at the bottom of the sheet. Meeting point. Kitchen porch. Copying the words from the cupboard, Lily tilted the paper and thickened the outline of the bell. The window stood open, and the breeze was cooler than in the morning. The wind chimes on the porch rang 3 notes, as if someone had just brushed them. Lily looked up, waiting. Nothing. She bent her head and kept drawing. By early afternoon, footsteps crunched on the gravel at the gate. The kitchen bell rang first, a pair of spoons Edward had hung together clinking in the wind. Then Mr. Bales's rope jangled. "You girls all right?" His voice called over the fence. "All right," Lily answered, standing at the kitchen threshold, her hand already resting on the brass bell's cord. "Someone came up the hill earlier," Bales said. "Didn't come in. Just stood there." He paused, Cole growled, and the man left. "Thank you, sir," Lily said. Lucy gave the bell's cord a quick tug, just a short pull like a wink. The bell chimed in reply. Mr. Bales walked away. On the porch, a small orange slip stuck out from under the doormat. Lily pulled it in. The printed header read, "Reminder, mandatory meeting, town council." Beneath it, scrawled by hand, "Brooks, 3 p.m. tomorrow." No recipient named, only the address of the house on the hill. Lily held the paper for a long moment, as if it carried an odor she couldn't place. She set it on the table, weighted it with a stone, and drew a tiny arrow pointing to it with the words, "Don't open the door," matching line number 1 on the cupboard. Lucy sat beside her, fingers fiddling with her plastic bracelet. "Grandpa will be home early tomorrow," she said to the air. By late afternoon, Edward returned, shoes gritty with dust. He opened the door with his key. The brass bell rang. Both girls poked their heads out, their eyes lighting like lamps. Edward looked straight at the orange slip, read it through without changing expression. He folded it and tucked it between the planning sheet on the cupboard. "Tomorrow we go," he said. "Both places." "Both?" Lucy asked. "Courthouse and hospital." Edward hung up his hat. "And maybe one more stop." "Where?" "The hardware store." He lifted the hammer. "We'll need more nails. Took out some old ones today. Tomorrow I may have to pull a few more." He pointed to the window frame, now open, and smiled thinly. Lily gathered the papers and pencils, setting bowls and plates on the table. Lucy tugged the bell cord once, a short ring like a greeting. The bell chimed, round and clear. On the porch, the wind chimes answered with 2 brittle notes. On the hill, the evening shadows stretched long. At the foot of the hill, the loudspeaker wheezed out its final words of the day. In the kitchen, 3 people moved around a wooden table, each holding a corner of a plan that didn't need to be spoken aloud. In the 3rd drawer, the brown folder still lay waiting for tomorrow. In the inside pocket, the watch kept ticking, waiting for its next opening, and under the doormat, no slip of paper poked out anymore. Only a faint trace of mud wiped nearly clean a small mark. Just enough to remember that someone had stood there, measured the doorway, weighed the bell, and would return to test how loud it really rang. Early morning. The brass bell rang softly as the wind moved across the porch. Edward checked the latch, pulled the wooden table back half an inch, and rehung the kitchen spoon cord so air could pass through. On the cupboard, the plan sheet was taped with brown packing tape. With a black pen, he added one more line. 6. Don't answer questions through the window. "You leaving now?" Lily asked, her hand resting on the bell cord the way she'd practiced. "Yes, courthouse, then hospital. Back by noon." Edward poured warm powdered milk and slid it toward the girls. "Remember Mr. Bales's cord?" "Remember," Lucy said. her fingers touching the plastic bracelet in her pocket as if calling roll. Mr. Bales appeared at the fence, holding a paper bag high. "Apple pie," he said. "My wife baked it last night." "Thank you," Edward replied. "If anyone comes up the hill, give me a sign." "You've got Cole," Bales nodded, patting the head of the black dog. "He barks before the bell ever rings," Edward set out. On the slope, the mist hadn't yet lifted. Down in the market square, the loudspeaker droned an old piece about community contribution. He pulled his collar higher, his left hand brushing now and then the inside pocket where phone and pocket watch rested. The town hall still smelled of floor wax. The same clerk as yesterday used the same flat voice. 14 days. She reminded him as she accepted the bundle of Form 12B. This one with Margaret Thompson's name written by hand. Edward laid down an additional page showing Calvin at the house last night. "I marked it urgent." "I have reason," Edward said. "We process in order," she muttered, stamping the page. Then, raising her head for the first time, she lowered her voice just enough to pass through the glass. "You keep an eye on who comes in the back gate." Edward tilted his head. In the hallway mirror, he caught the reflection of a man in a brown jacket, broad-shouldered, close-cropped hair, leaning toward an official with a badge. They glanced his way, then split apart. Edward didn't move closer. He lifted his phone and quietly snapped the mirror, capturing posture, distance, the habit of turning his head. At the bulletin board by the door, the Coleman and Company civil counsel card had fallen to the floor again, as if someone tacked it carelessly each morning. He bent, read the name Rachel Coleman, and slipped it into his outer pocket. Hospital. Room 203, still with pale green curtains. Caroline Hayes checked the IV line, glancing over her shoulder at Edward. "Good news and small news," she said. "Good, she's stronger." Small. Yesterday the sign outside the door listed, "Rebecca." "The wristband is correct, Margaret Thompson." "I fixed it." Edward nodded, offered no comment. "Can I speak with her?" "Briefly." Caroline stepped aside, her finger resting on the curtain hem as an invitation. Margaret opened her eyes when she heard the chair scrape. No sentimental words, only a nod, enough to recognize the unfamiliar face that had carried her children out of the marketplace. "They're safe," Edward said. "A house with windows open, the bell is hung." "Calvin?" Margaret asked, lips dry. "He knocked. I didn't open. Court has the file. Promises 14 days. Margaret stared at the ceiling. 14 days is long enough. For bad things. "Miss Hayes gave me her night number," Edward said, turning toward the nurse. Caroline nodded. "Yes, and I'll give you a name. Coleman, attorney, doesn't sweet talk. Says little, works steady." Edward sat straighter, touched the apple bag on the bedside table. "I have her card already." Margaret closed her eyes, breathing in measure. "Keep the children away from Calvin. He knows the path behind the house." Her voice broke before finishing the word, "him." Caroline jotted notes quickly. Edward asked no more. He placed a neatly folded square of cloth by her pillow and rose. "I'll be back this afternoon." He looked at Caroline. "If anyone signs for anyone else, call me." "I'll call," Caroline answered, "and I'll block any hand that shakes wrong." By noon, the hill was drier, the wind rougher. Lily and Lucy sat on the porch, fingertips stained with yellow and blue pencils. Half the apple pie from Bales was gone. The brass bell had been pulled so many times the cord was dark with sweat. "You're home," Lucy ran, making the bell swing with her steps. Edward set his bag on the table. Nails, a door chain, a small bottle of hinge oil. "The bell works," he said with a thin smile. "Bales?" "Yes," Lily said, "and another orange slip like yesterday, but no words." She pulled it from under the mat, handed it over. The page was blank. Only a small mud stain in one corner. "Leave it," Edward said, laying it by the plan sheet, weighting it with a stone. He opened the nail box, showed Lucy how to hold the hammer steady. She tried, hand trembling, the tapping mixing with the wind chimes outside. Lily passed him the chain pieces one by one. "Now burn that folder," Lucy said, glancing toward the drawer. "Get rid of the smell." Edward opened the third drawer and pulled out the brown board marked "Needy Family, Up for Adoption." The bold letters blurred with old sweat, dried now like years-old ink. He carried it to the backyard, laid it in a rusted pan. Lily stood to one side, Lucy the other. He struck a match. The board caught from the corner, curled in, snapping as it burned. No one spoke. When only black ash remained, Edward prodded it with a rod, then shut the lid. The smell of paper hung heavy, like cooking grease, clinging to their clothes. "Done," he said. "Now we add a new line." "Back inside," Lily wrote. 6. "Don't talk to people who leave papers under the mat." Lucy asked. "What if they ring the bell? Then call Bales, then call me." Edward answered shortly. He fastened the chain, oiled the hinges. The screech turned into an even breath. He checked the window frames again, wedged an extra piece of wood into a wide gap. Lucy stood ready with a candle, blowing it out when wax neared his hand. Lily returned the hammer neatly into the drawer labeled hammer. "This afternoon I'll head back to court," Edward said. "File what I missed." "You think you'll see the man with the seal?" Lucy asked. "Maybe," Edward said, eyes flicking to the kitchen window, where fresh mud marked the yard corner. He didn't point it out. He wiped it away, like erasing a wrong word from a wall. Around 4, the brass bell gave one firm ring. Lily jumped up, hand already on the cord. A man in a white shirt, tie loosened, clipboard in hand, stood on the porch. He didn't touch the door, only leaned so his voice carried through. "Good afternoon, Whitmore household. I'm with the council, here for a quick check on family welfare." Edward stepped forward, stopping just behind the chain. "Name?" "Mathers," the man replied, flashing an ID, then pulling it back quickly. "I need to confirm the children are in sanitary conditions. 5 minutes." "The porch will do," Edward said. "You ask, I answer." Mathers glanced quickly toward the kitchen, met Lucy's eyes. She stepped back half a pace, her hand still on the bell. Lily angled herself to shield her sister. Mathers gave a thin-lipped smile, not meeting their gaze. "Laundry, meals, medical records?" he fired, pen scraping the page in meaningless dashes. "Meals, bread, soup, apples, milk. Laundry, tomorrow. Medical, I was just at the hospital, room 203. Anything else?" "Guardianship papers?" Mathers raised an eyebrow. "In process. Form 12B. Urgent," Edward replied. "Regulations allow temporary care during review. No violence, no leaving children alone." Mathers jerked his chin toward Lily. "So, the older girl, can she speak?" Lily looked at Edward. He nodded. She said, "I eat enough. I sleep better than yesterday. We have a bell." "A bell?" Mathers wrote the word as if noting a typo. "A bell to call the neighbor and call him," Lucy added, hand tight on her bracelet, "and to let the wind in." Mathers paused his pen, unsettled by a detail not in his form. He stacked his pages, nodding as if satisfied. "Fine. I'll return once the court's papers arrive. You ring the bell first," Edward said. "Don't leave slips under the mat." Mathers arched a brow faintly, the habit of a man used to leaving traces without admitting them. "We have many addresses. Mistakes happen." He left, shoes crunching the gravel. On the porch step, a thin smear of mud glistened. Edward saw it, wiped it away at once. "Was he a good man?" Lucy asked. "He was a man who writes fast," Edward answered. He pulled down the plan sheet and added one more dot beside line 1. Night fell quickly. Supper was fried eggs, bread, and the last of the pie. Lily divided the portions evenly. Lucy dipped the edge of her slice in salt, laughed at the taste. Edward said nothing. He let the laughter circle the table once before fading. After the meal, he opened the third drawer, scooped the morning's ashes into the yard beneath a tree. Wind lifted the ash into a thin sheet before it fell again. He lingered longer than necessary, eyes fixed on the low row of trees. At the far edge of the dark, a tiny red spark flared, then died like the tip of a cigarette. "Bales?" he called, not loud, just enough for the black dog to hear. Cole barked twice from across the fence. The spark vanished. Edward went back in, bolted the back door. In the kitchen, Lily and Lucy sat shoulder to shoulder, studying the plan sheet as if it were a storybook. Lily added in pencil, 7. When the wind is strong, put the pencils in the box. Lucy drew a square around the 7. "Bedtime," Edward said, lowering the lamp. "Tomorrow we leave early." "Where?" Lily asked from the bedroom doorway. "To meet the person on that card," Edward answered, tapping his outer pocket, "and back to the hospital." Lucy tugged the bell cord softly, like a goodnight wish. The bell answered with a round note. On the porch, the wind chimes gave a thin reply. Edward switched off the kitchen light, sat a while in the cool dark, listening to the house breathe. In his pocket, the watch weighed exactly as much as an unspoken sentence. In the empty third drawer, the scent of burned paper had lifted, leaving space for other things that would have to be stored there. Receipts, photos, lines of writing few, but straight. Outside, tree shadows ran together into one solid band of black. At the edge of that black, there might have been someone. Inside the house, there was the bell, and there was slowness, faint but real, taking shape, a plan taped to the cupboard, each line another nail driven into wood. The morning was colder than the past few days. Edward lit the stove, poured water, and checked the plan sheet taped to the cupboard. With a black pen, he added one more line. 8. Call Bales twice, not just once. Lily read it out loud. Lucy repeated as if reciting the alphabet. "Who are you seeing today?" Lily asked. "The attorney." Edward folded the card he'd picked up at the courthouse, slipped it into his outer pocket. "Rachel Coleman." "Does she have a bell?" Lucy asked, half teasing. "She has files." Edward poured warm milk into cups and pushed them toward the girls. "Eat up, lock the chain, don't step onto the porch unless the bell rings." Mr. Bales passed by the fence, holding up a hammer. "Fixing my hinge. If anything happens, pull the cord." "Thank you." Edward touched 2 fingers to his hat brim. Cole growled low in his throat. A reminder he was there. The office of Coleman and Company sat at the end of a row of red brick buildings. Glass door polished clean, but the painted sign faded. The waiting room held only a water cooler and a pile of old law journals. Rachel Coleman opened the inner door and motioned him in. "Mr. Whitmore?" She stood crisp in a gray suit, hair pulled back, eyes steady. "Caroline Hayes warned me. Sit." Edward placed a packet of photos and the 12B form on her desk. 2 nights ago, he came knocking. Yesterday, someone from the council came for an inspection. This morning, I filed the addendum. Rachel turned Calvin's photo beneath the desk lamp, her other hand striking a red line under the corner of the picture where the edge of the house door showed. "You kept the originals?" "On my phone." Edward nodded. "And 2 orange slips shoved under the mat. 1 blank. 1 with his name." Rachel slid a paper clip tray toward him. "I'll need those photos, a short written statement from you, your neighbor Bales' testimony, and a confirmation letter from Caroline Hayes on the mother's condition. We'll file for emergency guardianship along with a temporary restraining order, no nighttime approach, no leaving papers. If a judge signs, police can escort." "How long?" Edward asked. "Maybe this afternoon, if we catch a duty judge." Rachel glanced at the wall clock. "But Maplewood doesn't move fast." "I'll call. You ready for not fast?" "I'm used to waiting," Edward said. "But the house isn't." Rachel pressed her lips together. "Then do this when you go back. Don't peel off any paper they stick on your door. Photograph it, keep it, then remove." If they use tar to paste it, don't scrape hard. I've got solvent. You guessed too quick, Edward said, not quite praising. You've seen much tar? Seen plenty of people who like leaving marks that don't wash out. Rachel answered, always with the line, just following regulation. Her desk phone buzzed. Rachel listened briefly, nodded, and hung up. 3:00. A judge will be at the county court. I'll go with you. But before that, I want to meet the man who likes leaving marks. The door opened. Not the judge. Calvin Brooks stood in the frame, brown coat, bloodshot eyes. He leaned against the jamb as if the office were a bar. Well, Calvin dragged out the word. Old man got himself a lawyer. Gonna teach me something? You're interfering with office hours, Rachel said, voice flat as her desk. Step outside. Calvin stepped further in, ignoring her. You even know who he is? Brings home somebody else's kids, shuts the door, hangs bells like calling cattle. I show up, he takes pictures. You're describing your own behavior, Rachel said evenly. Good for the record. Calvin laughed rough, jabbed a finger at Edward. Old fool. Maplewood doesn't need your tricks. Edward didn't answer. He raised his phone, held it level with his shoulder, pressed the shutter. Second photo, he said to the air. Rachel moved forward, opened the door wider. Step outside, Mr. Brooks, or I call police for harassment. Calvin's eyes flicked to her, then to Edward. This afternoon I'll come up the hill. Got a paper, official, with a seal. He backed away, rubbing his unshaven chin, and vanished. Rachel exhaled through her nose. Short. He spoke one true word. Paper. Which paper, that's the question. You'll come to the hill? Edward asked. After court. Rachel gathered the file. You go first. Lock tight. If the bell rings, don't open yourself. On the hill, sunlight was harsh. Lily and Lucy sat in the kitchen, the plan sheet spread like a map. Lucy penciled in, 9. Don't answer anyone asking is he home? Lily drew a small smiley next to the 9, then erased it, not fitting the mood. The chain rattled lightly. The brass bell rang twice steady, the pull of someone who knew the house. Mr. Bales? Lily called through the door. No? A man's voice answered, polite in a false way. Counsel. Lucy tugged the bell cord, the chime ringing full. Counsel rings the bell. She whispered to her sister. Slip paper only. Lily whispered back, quoting line 6. Her hand clutching the doll's bracelet, hidden under her shirt. We have an order for a surprise inspection, the voice continued, knuckles tapping the wood in dull thuds. Open within 5 minutes. Pass it through the crack, Lily said, keeping the distance Edward had taught. A yellow slip slid under the door. Black print, red seal. Lily placed it on the table, untouched. Call Bales, she said. Lucy ran to the fence window, yanked the cord. The tin can at Bales's place rattled. Cole barked sharp and fast. What is it? Bales appeared, hammer still in hand. They say counsel, Lily called through the frame, eyes locked on the yellow paper. Inspection order. Can you read it? Bales lifted it with his hammer's end, squinted. Real paper, real seal, he muttered. But the inspector's name, not Mathers, says oral authorization. That's no good. Door stays shut, Lily said, voice small but firm. Bales nodded. On the porch, footsteps shifted closer. A familiar voice cut in. 5 minutes are up. Calvin. He stood right against the door, pressing something sticky onto the wood, a black patch. Stinking chemical fumes. What are you doing? Bales barked, hammer banging the fence. Cole growled deep. Posting notice by regulation. Calvin drawled. Don't bother scraping. Lucy backed away from the door, gripping her bracelet tight. Lily peered through the peephole, a round black blot stuck on the door. One edge dripping like tar. Tar, she whispered. Stay inside, Bales said. I'll stand guard. Calvin chuckled, lifted his hand off the patch, leaving a smeared fingerprint. Tell the old man, this afternoon I've got another paper, with a seal, with someone at my side. He stepped back, kicked gravel down the steps, and left. Cole barked until his shadow disappeared. Bales remained until the girls had steadied, then returned to his fence. Warning: don't open. When he's back, show him. Edward hurried up the hill. The brass bell rang as he touched the door. The smell of tar hit his nose straight on. On the door's surface was a black, glossy circle, like a dead fish's eye, with a yellow slip stuck in the middle. He didn't touch it. First photo, he muttered, raising his phone. Close-up, angle, fingerprint. Lily handed him a clothespin. The lawyer said to use this. Edward pinched the paper's corner with it, lifting just enough off the tar to read the print. Lucy stood behind him holding a basin of laundry powder no one had told her, but she figured it might fix the smell. Is it real? Lily asked. It has words, Edward replied, folding it and slipping it into his file pouch. This afternoon we go to court with Miss Coleman. He tipped his hat toward the fence. Thanks, Bales. I'll stand here until you're done, Bales said, hammer resting on his shoulder. Edward mixed solvent in a small vial, what Rachel had given him that morning, and dripped a bead along the tar's edge. The black patch softened, peeling back like the rind of an orange. He tugged gently, lifting away piece by piece. The chemical reek mingled with the tar stench. Lucy coughed lightly. Lily threw open the windows, letting wind rush through, the chimes outside rattling in a long string that sounded like rain about to fall but not yet. When I'm not home, Edward said, eyes never leaving the door's surface. You did right. Don't open. Call. Ring the bell. You're not mad we didn't open? Lucy asked. I'm mad at the tar, Edward said. The bell good. He pulled off the final scrap, wiped the wood with a damp cloth. The black left a faint halo like a fresh scar. Edward touched it, no stickiness, then washed his hands, changed his coat. Let's go. We're going too? Lily asked. Yes, no leaving the house empty this afternoon. He glanced at Bales. You mind the porch? Cole's here. Bales nodded, winking. He likes paper on doors. The county courthouse was busier in the afternoon. Rachel waited on the steps, file tucked under her arm. The photos? Edward handed them over. Rachel flipped through, nodded. Enough. She crouched, bringing her eyes level with the children. Inside, say little. If asked your name, answer. If asked what food you like, stay quiet. That's not in the record. Lucy pressed her lips tight. Lily held her sister's hand. The hearing room was small, benches packed tight. A silver-haired judge with glasses sat behind a stack of files. Mathers, the man with the loose tie from yesterday, stood at the side, clipboard in hand. Calvin leaned against the wall, old coat hanging, his eyes bloodshot with fatigue. Rachel stood firm. Emergency guardianship petition, temporary restraining order, with photographs, statement, and medical confirmation. The judge leafed through the papers, unhurried. Mr. Whitmore, he said, do you affirm your commitment? Edward nodded. I do. Mr. Bales' neighbor? Here, Bales said, unexpectedly behind them, hammer grease still on his hands. Caroline Hayes also slipped in at the door, white coat on, face bare of daytime makeup. Calvin sneered. Just because the old man took a few pictures, now it's paperwork. Rachel looked straight at him. And because you smeared tar on someone's front door. The judge lifted his gaze, adjusted his glasses. Tar? Rachel slid the photo forward. The smell still clings to the children's coats. The judge studied it longer than necessary, then drew a single stroke of his pen across the order before him. Temporary restraining order, 7 days. No approach within 50 meters. No posting papers. No knocking after 6 p.m. Formal hearing set for the 10th day. Until then, the children remain with Mr. Whitmore. County council may inspect during daylight by appointment. Mathers coughed lightly, as if swallowing a crumb. Calvin jerked his chin up. 7 days? Then what? Then we reach the 10th day, the judge said, not looking at him. And if you paste anything else on a man's door, I'll sign something else. Rachel gathered the order, gave a brief thanks. She bent to meet Lily in Lucy's eyes. This part is done. Home now. Calvin brushed past Edward at the exit, shoulder nudging hard. You think a chain lock will hold back what comes from inside the council? He whispered low enough that only Edward heard. I've got people. Edward didn't answer. He opened the pocket watch in his coat. Glanced 1 second. Snapped it shut. The snap was quiet, but perfectly timed. On the hill, evening light poured through the trees. Rachel stopped at the gate, pointed squarely at the door. Don't paint over it yet. Leave the stain. It tells the story. Lucy tugged the bell cord once, greeting the porch. The bell rang full. Lily sat down, opened her pencil, and added to the plan sheet. 10. Don't answer anyone who says, someone on the council is my friend. Edward gave a thin smile. Tomorrow, Rachel said. I'll come early. We'll draft the full petition. Caroline will send her letter. Mr. Bales will sign his testimony. Do we need to burn anything else? Lucy asked, glancing at the empty third drawer. No, Rachel said. Leave it all. The court will need the smell tomorrow. Night fell. The wind outside shifted direction. The chimes rattled a short phrase. On the wall, the tar halo darkened in shadow like a fresh bruise. Edward hung the pocket watch beside the plan sheet, letting its hands tick against each written line. Lily and Lucy spread their blanket. No one spoke of 7 days. They spoke of the bell instead. At the fence, Cole rumbled deep in his throat, a watchdog made of fur. On the slope, the gravel lay still, as though someone had just finished counting each stone. And inside the house, life slowed again. One more chain, one more line, one more witness. The rest would wait for tomorrow.